Imagine a time when your very existence, your physical self, felt like it belonged not to you, but to a web of rules, expectations, and laws spun by others. A time when choices about your body, your future, even your breath, were made by someone else entirely. What if your value was literally tied to how many children you could bear, or how well you could manage a household? What if stepping outside your home without a man by your side was unthinkable? In the year 1208, these weren't just hypotheticals for women, they were the stark realities of daily life. Number 11, travel and movement. Think about a woman in 1208 standing at the threshold of her home, or perhaps the edge of her village. Even that simple act of contemplation about leaving, about moving freely from one place to another, was fraught with invisible chains. Her body, her physical self, was not truly her own to command in terms of mobility. The world outside the confines of her immediate, familiar surroundings was largely forbidden territory unless she was accompanied, permitted, or directly involved in an essential task that necessitated travel. For most women, especially those of the peasantry who formed the vast majority of the population, their lives were geographically limited to their village, the fields surrounding it, and perhaps a nearby market town. The reasons for this profound restriction on a woman's freedom of movement were manifold, woven into the very structure of medieval society. Firstly, there was the pervasive concern for safety. The roads and pathways of 1208 were far from safe. Bandits, vagrants, and opportunistic criminals posed a constant threat. A lone woman, particularly one traveling with any discernible possessions, would have been seen as an easy target. Without the protection of a male escort, a father, a husband, a brother, or even a servant or guard from a noble household, a woman's physical safety was severely compromised. This wasn't merely a polite suggestion, it was a deeply ingrained social expectation. Travel alone was to invite suspicion, danger, and often social condemnation. Her reputation, already a precarious thing, could be utterly ruined by such perceived recklessness. Who was she, wandering about without a proper escort? What was her purpose? Such questions quickly devolved into whispers and accusations, painting her as immoral or without proper standing. Historical texts, such as records of local customs and legal rulings from the era, frequently mention cases where women were penalized or viewed with suspicion simply for being found far from their established residence without a clear, sanctioned reason and an escort. Beyond the immediate threats, there were also practical and legal impediments. A woman's legal identity was almost entirely subsumed by her male guardian, whether father or husband. She often could not conduct business independently, sign contracts, or represent herself in legal disputes without a male present. How then could she effectively manage the logistics of travel, such as arranging lodging or passage, which often involved agreements and payments that she was not legally empowered to make? Even if she had the means, her capacity to act as an independent agent was severely curtailed. For noblewomen, while they might travel more extensively, their journeys were typically carefully orchestrated affairs, part of a larger retinue, serving political or marital purposes. Their bodies were moved, yes, but not by their own free will. They were transported as part of an alliance, a marriage agreement, or a demonstration of power, often encased within carriages or riding with armed guards. The physical act of traversing the landscape was a collective endeavor, not a personal whim. A noblewoman might journey from her father's castle to her betrothed's, a long and arduous trip that placed immense physical strain on her, yet it was not a journey she chose, nor one she undertook for her own pleasure. Her body was merely the vehicle for the transfer of alliances and property. Furthermore, social norms dictated that a woman's place was primarily within the home, or at least within the immediate orbit of her community. Her duties were tied to the domestic sphere, the care of children, the preparation of food, the making of household goods, and often assisting with agricultural tasks close to the village. Physical presence was expected, and indeed required for the smooth functioning of the household. To be absent for extended periods without compelling reason was seen as shirking her responsibilities. Religious teachings also played a role. The church emphasized domesticity and modesty for women, and wandering implied a lack of these virtues. A woman who was seen to roam freely was often associated with immoral behavior, with vagrancy, or even with witchcraft, particularly if she possessed any knowledge of herbal remedies or had an unusual demeanor. Her body, if it dared to stray too far, was immediately suspect, subject to scrutiny and judgment by the community. Her very physical appearance, if it did not conform to the expected demure and contained image of a woman, could invite unwanted attention, further compromising her safety and reputation. The idea of a woman traveling for personal discovery, for leisure, or for an independent career was virtually non-existent in 1208. Physical journey was intrinsically linked to the needs and demands of her family, her husband, or her lord, never truly her own. Her body, capable of movement, was nevertheless confined by an intricate web of societal expectations, legal constraints, and genuine physical dangers, rendering her mobility more a matter of managed necessity than personal freedom. Number 10. Physical security and assault. The year 1208 saw women existing in a constant state of vulnerability, where the physical safety of their bodies was precariously balanced and often outside of their personal control. This wasn't merely about the dangers of traveling alone, as we explored earlier, but about the fundamental lack of legal and social protection for a woman's body against violence, particularly sexual violence. In many respects, a woman's body was considered property, not her own independent entity. It belonged first to her father, then to her husband. This concept meant that an offense against her body, especially sexual assault, was often viewed more as a violation of her male guardian's property or honor than as a crime against her person. The legal system, rudimentary and patriarchal as it was, reflected this perspective. If a woman was raped, the crime was frequently categorized as a trespass against her father's or husband's possession, rather than a violation of her individual rights or autonomy. The legal recourse available to her was severely limited, and justice, as we understand it today, was a rare commodity. A woman's testimony in court was often deemed less reliable than a man's, and she might even be required to have a male speak on her behalf. This meant that the burden of proof was incredibly high, and the accused often had many avenues for escape or denial. Moreover, the social stigma attached to a woman who had been assaulted was immense. Honor was considered compromised, and her marriage prospects, if she was unmarried, could be ruined. She might be blamed for the assault, accused of enticing her attacker or of not resisting enough. Her body, having been violated, became a mark of shame, a testament not to her suffering, but to her supposed moral failing. This societal judgment, often more severe than any legal punishment meted out to the perpetrator, meant that many assaults went unreported. Consider the domestic sphere, often idealized as a safe haven. For women in 1208, even within their own homes, their bodies were not entirely safe from physical harm, particularly from their husbands. While medieval law did not explicitly condone marital violence in the same way it condoned violence against serfs by their lords, the husband's authority over his wife was vast and largely unchecked. A husband was considered the head of the household, with broad disciplinary powers over his family, including his wife. He was expected to chastise her if she misbehaved or defied him. While there were theoretical limits to this, he should not inflict mortal blows or permanent injury. These limits were rarely enforced. A woman who sought redress for marital violence faced enormous obstacles. She would have to prove extreme abuse, and even then, legal intervention was rare. The Church, while condemning excessive cruelty, also upheld the husband's authority, often counseling wives to endure rather than resist or seek separation. Her body, within the confines of her marriage, was seen as subject to her husband's will, even to the point of physical correction. This power dynamic meant that a woman's physical integrity was constantly at risk, not just from outside threats, but from those who were supposed to protect her. There are scarce direct records detailing everyday marital violence from 1208, but later medieval court documents and anecdotal accounts, often from church councils discussing spousal duties, illustrate that it was a recognized, if rarely punished, reality. Furthermore, the vulnerability of women's bodies extended to situations beyond the purely personal. During times of war, invasion, or even local skirmishes, women were particularly susceptible to violence. Their bodies became spoils of war, instruments of humiliation for defeated enemies, or targets of opportunistic brutality by soldiers. Chronicles and historical accounts from the period, though often written by men and focusing on military campaigns, occasionally hint at the widespread suffering of civilian populations, with women disproportionately bearing the brunt of physical assaults during conflicts. The notion of non-combatant protection, especially for women, was largely absent. Their bodies, whether of peasant stock or nobility, were seen as legitimate targets by invading forces. The concept of individual human rights, which would later afford some degree of protection to a person's body regardless of gender, was centuries away. In 1208, a woman's physical security was fundamentally conditional. Depended on the protection offered by her male kin, the prevailing social norms, the limited reach of an often indifferent justice system, and the sheer luck of avoiding situations where her body would be seen as an object of aggression, ownership, or punishment. Corporeal self, rather than being a sovereign domain, was an open field, susceptible to invasion and harm with little recourse or personal control. Number 9. Beauty standards and body modification. In 1208, the concept of beauty for a woman was far removed from personal expression or individual choice. Instead, it was a collective judgment, dictated by societal norms rooted in religious teachings, social status, and the practicalities of daily life. A woman's body was not her own to adorn or alter as she wished. Rather, it was expected to conform to a specific set of ideals that prioritized modesty, fertility, and an outward display of her family's status. Dominant Christian doctrine of the time played a significant role in shaping these standards. The Church often viewed excessive ornamentation or attention to one's physical appearance as vanity, a sin that could lead to spiritual decay. Therefore, modesty was paramount. This meant that a woman's body was expected to be covered, particularly her hair, especially if she was married. Veiling was common for married women in most social classes, signifying her marital status, her piety, and her adherence to social norms. Her hair, considered a powerful symbol of female allure, was to be concealed, not displayed. For a woman to expose her hair, or to style it in an elaborate way that drew attention to it, was often seen as immodest or even a sign of loose morals. Her very hair, a part of her body, was not hers to display freely. Noblewomen might wear elaborate coifs or wimples, sometimes adorned with jewelry, but these were still designed to cover the hair and frame the face in a dignified, rather than overtly alluring, manner. Peasant women simply wore plain head coverings. The physical act of covering one's head was a daily ritual, a constant reminder that her body, even its seemingly innocuous parts, was subject to external rule. Beyond modesty, the prevailing ideal for a woman's body was a reflection of health and the capacity for childbearing. A certain plumpness, indicating good health and sufficient sustenance, was often admired, particularly for women who would be expected to bear many children and endure the physical demands of medieval life. Slenderness was not generally a favored attribute. A woman's body was valued for its ability to produce heirs and to perform labor, not for aesthetic reasons that deviated from these practical functions. Therefore, there was little to no cultural impetus for women to engage in practices aimed at altering their physical shape or size, such as dieting or corsetry, as would become common in later centuries. Their bodies were to be functional, robust, and fertile, not sculpted to an artificial ideal. Practices like tattooing or piercing, common in some ancient cultures, were almost entirely absent and would have been viewed with extreme suspicion, perhaps even as pagan or demonic. Such alterations would have been seen as a desecration of the body, which was considered a vessel for the soul, created in God's image. To intentionally mark or change it in a significant way would have been a profoundly transgressive act. Cosmetics, too, were generally viewed with suspicion, particularly by the church. While some noblewomen might use very subtle preparations, such as a touch of red to their lips or cheeks, or a salve to whiten their skin, overt makeup was often associated with prostitutes or women of low moral standing. It was considered deceitful, an attempt to hide one's true appearance and to tempt men. Therefore, the desire for a woman to enhance her beauty, to present her body in a way she personally preferred, was constrained by these powerful social and religious prohibitions. Her face, her skin, her hair, all elements of her physical presentation were under surveillance, not for individual expression, but for conformity to a prescribed ideal of virtue and utility. A woman's body was meant to be naturally appealing within the bounds of modesty, and its value lay not in its adornment or alteration, but in its health, its capacity for reproduction, and its ability to reflect the honor of her family. Any attempt to deviate from these norms, to truly take control of her physical appearance for personal gratification or expression, risked social ostracization, moral condemnation, and a damaged reputation. Physical self, even down to the simple act of choosing how to present her hair or face, was not her own domain. Number 8. Religious control. In the year 1208, the Christian Church permeated every aspect of life, and its influence on women's bodies was profound, shaping not only their moral conduct, but also their perceived physical essence. Church's doctrines and interpretations of Scripture placed significant constraints on a woman's autonomy over her own body, framing it primarily as a vessel for procreation, a source of temptation, or a vehicle for spiritual salvation through chastity. One of the most pervasive ideas was the concept of woman as the temptress, stemming from the biblical story of Eve. This narrative often positioned women's bodies as inherently dangerous, prone to sin, and capable of leading men astray. This belief fueled intense scrutiny over women's sexuality. Her body, with its perceived capacity to incite lust, was therefore subject to strict control and regulation. Virginity was held in extremely high regard for unmarried women, not just as a moral virtue, but as a marker of her purity and eligibility for marriage. The loss of virginity before marriage was a profound transgression, not merely a personal choice, but a violation of deeply held religious and social norms. It could ruin a woman's reputation, prevent her from securing a suitable marriage, and even lead to social ostracization. Her body in its untouched state was considered a valuable commodity, a reflection of her and her family's honor. Its integrity was paramount, controlled by external expectations. For married women, the purpose of their bodies shifted to procreation. The Church explicitly taught that the primary, if not sole, purpose of marital relations was to produce children. Sexual pleasure, while acknowledged, was secondary and often viewed with suspicion if pursued for its own sake. A woman's body was therefore expected to be fertile, and her reproductive capacity was seen as her most vital contribution to both her family and to God's plan. To resist procreation, or to attempt to control it through early, rudimentary forms of contraception, which were largely ineffective and condemned, was considered a sin. Her womb was not her own. It was a sacred space intended for the creation of new life, a duty imposed upon her by religious doctrine. Pressure to bear children, particularly male heirs, was immense, not only from societal expectations, but also from the Church's emphasis on fruitful marriages. If a woman was barren, her body was seen as failing in its divinely appointed purpose, leading to immense personal sorrow, social stigma, and even the possibility of her husband seeking an annulment or a second wife. Physical inability to conceive was not simply a medical condition, but a spiritual failing in the eyes of many. The Church also offered a path for women who wished to dedicate their bodies entirely to God: monastic life. While this might appear to be a choice, it was often the only acceptable alternative for women who did not marry, particularly those of noble birth for whom a suitable match could not be found. Entering a convent meant taking vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, effectively surrendering all autonomy over one's body and life to the religious order. Her body, previously subject to her family's marriage plans, was now subject to the strictures of monastic rule, often involving rigorous fasting, manual labor, and communal living with little personal space or privacy. Even here, within the supposed freedom of spiritual devotion, her body remained a vessel for religious purpose, whether that be arduous prayer, self-denial, or service to the community, rather than an independent entity. Physical actions, her diet, her sleep, her very posture were dictated by the rule of the order. The religious control over women's bodies in 1208 was pervasive, from the emphasis on virginity and purity before marriage, to the expectation of prolific childbearing within marriage, and finally, to the complete surrender of bodily autonomy in monastic life. Her body, therefore, was not merely a physical presence, but a deeply symbolic one, constantly interpreted and regulated by the dominant religious ideology of the age, shaping every aspect of her existence from birth to death. Number 7. Legal status and testimony. In the year 1208, the legal landscape for women was a stark reminder that their bodies, and indeed their very identities, were not considered independent entities. Instead, a woman's legal status was almost entirely defined by her relationship to a man, be it her father, her husband, or in some cases, her male guardian or brother. This foundational principle meant that she generally could not act as an autonomous legal agent, rendering her body, in a judicial sense, a dependent appendage rather than a sovereign self. One of the most significant limitations was a woman's ability to participate in legal proceedings. For the vast majority of cases, a woman could not represent herself in court. She needed a male guardian to act on her behalf. This applied to everything from property disputes, where she might have a claim through inheritance or dower rights, to cases of personal injury or debt. Presence in the courtroom was often merely symbolic, or she might not be present at all, her voice channeled through a male proxy. Her body, standing or sitting in the court, possessed no inherent legal authority. Its existence was conditional on the male figure beside her. Even when she was directly involved as a victim of a crime, such as assault or theft, her testimony was often viewed as less credible than a man's. The legal system, steeped in patriarchal assumptions, questioned a woman's rationality, emotional stability, and general trustworthiness. This meant that her personal account of events, her physical experience of a crime, could be easily dismissed or challenged unless corroborated by male witnesses or overwhelming physical evidence. The very integrity of her experience, recorded through her senses and embodied in her person, was deemed suspect simply because she was a woman. Consider the act of witnessing a contract or a legal agreement. While a woman might be physically present, her signature or oath often held less weight than a man's. In many jurisdictions, she might not even be legally able to sign a contract on her own, particularly if she was married. This meant that transactions involving land, goods, or services, even those she might be directly involved in through her household duties or small personal enterprise, had to be formally concluded by her husband or father. Her labor, her skills, her very physical efforts in producing goods or managing a household, translated into an economic value that was ultimately controlled and legally administered by a male. Her body, working to produce this value, was a tool within a system where she had no independent legal standing for its output. Furthermore, a woman's body was explicitly used in certain legal rituals that highlighted her lack of autonomy. For instance, in some forms of land transfer or oaths, a woman might be physically required to participate, perhaps by touching a specific object or making a gesture, but this was a symbolic act of consent to an agreement already made by her male guardian, not an exercise of her own will. Physical presence was merely a necessary component for the ritual to be legally binding for her husband or father. Even in rare instances where a woman might hold some independent legal standing, such as a wealthy widow who inherited property and had no adult male children, her position was an anomaly rather than the norm. These women, often known as femsole, single women, whether unmarried or widowed, might manage their own affairs and represent themselves in court, but their circumstances were exceptions to the general rule that married women, femcovert, were legally subsumed by their husbands. The legal identity of a femcovert was largely extinguished upon marriage. Property, her debts, her legal personhood, all became her husband's. This meant that any contracts she had previously made, any rights she had held, were now in his control. Her body, having entered into the marital union, became legally indistinct from his, at least in the eyes of the law. This profound lack of legal independence meant that a woman's body, her physical presence, and her experiences were filtered through the lens of male authority in the medieval legal system. She was, in essence, a dependent, her physical existence and actions requiring the legal validation and representation of a man. Personal autonomy, especially in the eyes of the law, was a concept centuries from realization, leaving her body as an instrument and a ward rather than a self-determining entity. Number 6. Labor and physical expectations. In 1208, a woman's body was a tireless engine, subjected to an unrelenting regimen of physical labor that shaped her posture, her strength, and often the very limits of her endurance. Far from being a delicate or ornamental figure, the vast majority of women, particularly those in peasant and artisan households, were deeply integrated into the physically demanding tasks of daily life. Their bodies were not their own to rest or to choose their exertion. They were essential components of the household economy, their physical capabilities constantly exploited for the survival and sustenance of their families. For a peasant woman, her day began before dawn and ended long after dusk. Her body was engaged in a continuous cycle of strenuous chores. She would be responsible for fetching water, often from a distant well or river, carrying heavy wooden buckets that strained her shoulders and back. She would gather firewood, hauling bundles of branches that chafed her hands and tested her strength. Cooking over an open hearth was not a simple matter. It involved grinding grain into flour, kneading heavy dough, and tending to fires, all physically demanding tasks that required constant bending, lifting, and stirring. Her hands, rough and calloused, were never idle. She spun wool or flax into thread, a repetitive motion that could cause strain in her wrists and arms. She wove cloth, a back-breaking process, using a loom that required precise and forceful movements. Physical being was constantly in motion, producing the necessities of life. Beyond the domestic sphere, women's bodies were also vital to agricultural production. While men typically handled the heaviest plowing and sowing, women participated extensively in lighter fieldwork, which was nonetheless exhausting. They weeded fields under the hot sun, their bodies stooped for hours. They harvested crops, often using sickles that required repetitive arm movements and presented a constant risk of injury. They gleaned leftover grains after the harvest, bending and stooping for hours to gather every last stalk. They milked cows, tended to small livestock, and worked in gardens. Their bodies were constantly exposed to the elements: the scorching sun, the biting wind, the chilling damp, leading to premature aging, chronic aches, and susceptibility to illness. There was no concept of a work-life balance or scheduled breaks. Work simply continued until the tasks were done. Even the act of breastfeeding, a natural function of a woman's body, was often performed while simultaneously engaged in other laborious tasks, further draining her physical reserves. Her body, even in its most intimate and nurturing functions, was a tool in the relentless struggle for survival. For women in urban settings, particularly those married to artisans or merchants, the physical demands might differ in kind, but not in intensity. Their bodies were instrumental in assisting their husbands' trades. Baker's wife might be up before dawn, kneading enormous batches of dough. Blacksmith's wife might pump the bellows, assisting with the intense heat and physical exertion of the forge. A merchant's wife might manage the shop, standing for long hours, lifting and arranging goods, and dealing with customers. Their physical presence was not just for show, it was essential for the operation of the business. Even noblewomen, while spared the most grueling manual labor, were not entirely exempt. They were expected to manage large households, which involved overseeing numerous servants, often requiring long hours on their feet, inspecting, instructing, and ensuring the smooth running of the castle or manor. Their bodies, though cloaked in finer garments, were still subject to the physical demands of supervision and administration, with significant mental and physical strain. Constant, physically demanding nature of women's labor in 1208 meant that their bodies were perpetually in service to the household, the family, and the broader community. They were tools of production, their strength and endurance systematically utilized, leaving little room for personal comfort, leisure, or the independent command of their own physical selves. The concept of her body belonging to herself, to be used as she saw fit, was a luxury utterly unknown to the vast majority of women whose existence was defined by relentless physical exertion. Number 5. Healthcare and healing. In 1208, when illness struck or a bodily injury occurred, a woman's agency over her own physical health was virtually non-existent, often relegated to a precarious mix of folk remedies, limited professional intervention, and pervasive superstition. Her body, when ailing, was not her own to diagnose, treat, or even fully understand. Instead, its fate lay in the hands of others, often unskilled local healers, family members, or, if she was fortunate enough to access them, male physicians whose medical knowledge was rudimentary and heavily influenced by ancient theories and religious dogma. The formal medical establishment of the High Middle Ages was largely male-dominated. Physicians trained in universities relied on classical texts by figures like Hippocrates and Galen, which emphasized the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was seen as an imbalance of these humors. Treatments often involved bloodletting, purging, or the application of poultices. These practices were often painful, ineffective, and sometimes even dangerous. For a woman, accessing such a physician was often a privilege of the wealthy. Peasant women rarely saw a doctor, relying instead on family remedies passed down through generations, or the wisdom of a local wise woman or midwife. While these women often possessed valuable practical knowledge of herbs and traditional cures, their practices were frequently viewed with suspicion by the church and official authorities, sometimes even leading to accusations of witchcraft. If a woman's body responded poorly to their treatments, or if her illness seemed unusual, she might be accused of having a demonic affliction or being a witch herself. Her body's natural response to illness was interpreted through a lens of fear and spiritual judgment, rather than clinical observation. Perhaps the most critical area where a woman's body was not her own in healthcare was during childbirth. This was a profoundly dangerous event in 1208, with high mortality rates for both mother and child. During labor, a woman was typically attended by other women, her mother, sisters, or experienced midwives. These women, while offering comfort and practical support, possessed little understanding of obstetric complications. There were no surgical interventions, no pain relief beyond herbal remedies or perhaps prayer, and no real way to manage complex deliveries. If a woman's labor was prolonged or went awry, her body was simply left to its own devices, often with tragic consequences. Cries of pain, her exhaustion, her very physical struggle were seen as natural parts of the process, perhaps even a penance for Eve's sin. Her body was a vessel enduring a terrifying ordeal, with virtually no medical agency or control over the outcome. The knowledge and practices surrounding childbirth were often shrouded in secrecy and ritual, further emphasizing the lack of individual autonomy over her own reproductive health. Beyond childbirth, women also faced unique challenges related to female ailments, which were poorly understood and often attributed to moral failings or the wandering of the womb. Menstruation, menopause, and gynecological issues were shrouded in misunderstanding and shame. Treatments for these conditions were often crude and based on erroneous beliefs. A woman suffering from such ailments might be subjected to remedies that were more harmful than helpful, or she might simply be told to endure her suffering as a natural part of her female lot. Her body's natural physiological processes were often viewed as mysterious, even unsettling, by the male medical establishment, leading to a lack of compassionate or effective care. The idea of a woman advocating for her own body's needs, questioning medical advice, or seeking alternative treatments was almost unthinkable. Physical suffering was often a private burden, shared only with other women, and addressed with the limited means available within her immediate community. Her body, when sick or in pain, was a passive recipient of external interventions, interpretations, and judgments, fundamentally outside her own control or understanding. The very concept of bodily autonomy in matters of health was a distant dream for women in 1208, leaving them vulnerable to suffering and often to premature death, with little to no say in the decisions affecting their most fundamental well-being. Number 4, dress codes and modesty. Imagine the daily ritual of dressing for a woman in 1208. It wasn't simply about choosing what to wear based on personal preference or even comfort. Instead, her body was encased in layers of clothing and coverings that served as a visual manifestation of societal expectations, religious doctrines, and her social status. These were not choices, but rather deeply ingrained dress codes that stripped her of personal autonomy over her physical presentation, enforcing modesty and conformity. For the vast majority of women, regardless of their social standing, the prevailing expectation was to cover their bodies extensively. Modesty was paramount, driven by Christian teachings that viewed the female form as a potential source of temptation. This meant that a woman's body was rarely, if ever, seen unclothed, even within the confines of her own home beyond the most intimate moments. Her neck, arms, and legs were typically covered. Her hair, especially if she was married, was almost universally concealed by a veil, wimple, or coif. To expose her hair was a grave breach of social decorum, often interpreted as a sign of loose morals or an invitation for male attention, bringing dishonor not only to herself but to her entire family. Physical act of veiling was a daily submission, a constant reminder that her body was not for public display or personal adornment, but for the containment of her sensuality and the presentation of her virtue. This was not a fashion trend, but a deeply ingrained social and religious imperative. Sumptuary laws, though more prevalent in later centuries, were already beginning to emerge and reflect the era's concern with social order and appearance. These laws dictated what people could wear based on their social class and income. While they applied to men as well, they often had particular implications for women, whose clothing was seen as a direct reflection of their husband's or father's status. Peasant woman's body would be clad in simple, practical garments made of rough homespun linen or wool, designed for durability and warmth, not for aesthetic appeal. Her physical appearance was meant to communicate her humble station. She would not dare to wear colors or materials reserved for the nobility, such as silk or fine dyes, for fear of legal repercussions or social condemnation. Her body, dressed in its simple attire, broadcast her place in the strict social hierarchy, a place she could not choose to transcend simply by adorning herself differently. For noblewomen, while their clothing was richer and more elaborate, their choices were still constrained by strict dictates of courtly fashion and appropriate display of wealth. Their gowns might be made of finer wool or silk, but they would still be voluminous, covering most of the body, and designed to convey dignity and status, rather than a form-fitting sensuality. Sleeves were often long and wide, skirts full, and necklines high. Their bodies were enveloped in layers of cloth that restricted natural movement, a subtle physical manifestation of their constrained social role. Even the colors and types of garments were imbued with meaning. Certain colors were associated with specific virtues or professions, or were simply too expensive for the lower classes. A woman's choice of attire, therefore, was not a matter of personal taste, but a public declaration of her social standing and moral character. Her body, clothed according to these rigid rules, was a billboard of her conformity to the established order. The very act of dressing became a performance of societal expectation. There was little room for individual expression or deviation from these norms. A woman who dressed too extravagantly for her station, or too provocatively, even by 1208 standards, which meant showing ankles or an inappropriate amount of neck, risked public censure, gossip, and a damaged reputation. Her body, when dressed in defiance of these norms, was seen as a challenge to the social fabric and an affront to modesty. Therefore, from the layers of clothing that concealed her form to the head coverings that hid her hair, a woman's body in 1208 was a carefully curated public spectacle, subject to pervasive external control. It was not her own to present as she wished, but a canvas upon which societal expectations of modesty, virtue, and status were meticulously inscribed, leaving her with virtually no personal agency over her physical appearance. Number 3. Property rights. In the year 1208, the concept of a woman's body as a form of property was deeply embedded in the legal and social structures of the time, particularly in the context of marriage and inheritance. Her very physical existence was often intertwined with economic transactions, dowries, and the transfer of wealth, making her not an independent owner of assets, but often an asset herself. This meant that her body and the life it contained were not primarily her own to control, but rather objects within a larger system of familial and feudal power. The most profound manifestation of this was the dowry system. When a woman married, her family typically provided a dowry to her husband. This was essentially a gift of money, land, or goods that she brought into the marriage. While intended to provide for her and her children, the dowry often passed into the direct control of her husband. He managed it, and in many cases, legally owned it. The woman's body, therefore, became the vessel through which this valuable property was transferred from one family to another. It was a tangible asset accompanying her into the new household. The marriage ended, particularly through the death of the husband. Retrieving the dowry could be a complex and challenging legal battle for the widow, highlighting that it was often seen as her husband's property, not hers, even though it originated from her family. Her value, in part, was literally quantified by the assets she brought, making her body integral to the economic transaction. Beyond the dowry, a married woman, known legally as femme covert, lost most of her independent property rights. Her husband gained legal control over her inherited land, her income, and any personal possessions she brought into the marriage. She could not buy, sell, or manage property without his consent, and often not even with it, as the property was legally considered his. This meant that her physical labor, her efforts in managing the household, or her contributions to any family enterprise, while essential, did not translate into independent economic power or property ownership in her own name. Her body, perpetually working and contributing to the family's wealth, was nevertheless disconnected from the legal ownership of that wealth. The very concept of her having a separate estate or financial autonomy was largely foreign. While she might possess clothing or jewelry, these were often considered her husband's property as well, or at least under his ultimate control. Physical being, though the locus of much valuable work, yielded no direct economic sovereignty. Inheritance laws further underscored this lack of autonomy. In many regions, particularly under feudal law, land and titles primarily descended through the male line. Daughters might receive a portion of movable goods or a lesser share of land, often as a dowry to facilitate their marriage, but they rarely inherited the primary estate unless there were no male heirs whatsoever. If a woman did inherit land, her husband typically gained control of it upon marriage. Her body, as a female heir, was primarily a conduit for the transfer of property to her male kin or her husband's family, rather than an independent claimant to wealth. Even the concept of dower, which was a widow's right to a portion of her deceased husband's land or income for her support, emphasized her dependency. This was not property she owned outright, but a provision made for her sustenance, often reverting to her husband's heirs upon her own death. Her right to this land was tied to her body's former union with her husband, not to her independent legal standing. Physical presence as a widow was a necessary condition for receiving this support, but it did not grant her full control over the property itself. The intricate web of property laws in 1208 effectively rendered a woman's body a part of the family patrimony, a valuable asset to be transferred, protected, and managed by men, rather than an independent entity capable of acquiring and controlling its own wealth. Physical self was inextricably linked to the economic currents of her family, reinforcing the pervasive notion that she was not her own, but part of a larger, male-dominated economic structure. Number 2, childbirth. In the year 1208, childbirth was a terrifying and often fatal ordeal for women, starkly illustrating that her body was not her own, but a battleground where life and death hung in a delicate balance, largely beyond her control. The act of bringing new life into the world was fraught with immense physical danger, and the lack of medical understanding meant that a woman's body was left to endure the process with very little intervention or pain relief. It was a physical and spiritual trial, where her autonomy was surrendered to the brutal realities of nature and the rudimentary knowledge of her attendants. The sheer physical pain of labor was immense. There were no modern anesthetics, no epidurals. Women endured hours, sometimes days, of excruciating contractions, their bodies racked by the process. Herbal remedies might be offered to ease discomfort or induce labor, but their efficacy was limited. Instead, prayers, spiritual comfort, and the presence of other women were the primary forms of support. Her body was a vessel enduring agony, often without privacy or personal space, surrounded by well-meaning but ultimately powerless women. The very notion of her own bodily comfort or choice in managing the pain was simply not a consideration. Endurance was the expectation. The mortality rates for both mothers and infants were appallingly high. Historical estimates suggest that between 10 to 30% of medieval mothers died during or shortly after childbirth, often from complications like hemorrhage, infection, puerperal fever, or exhaustion. For the woman, her body was a ticking clock of uncertainty during pregnancy and labor. Each contraction, each push, brought her closer to either the profound joy of a new life or her own demise. She had no way to control her body's response to these immense stresses, nor any means to prevent the often deadly complications. Infections, common due to unhygienic practices by attendants and the lack of understanding of germ theory, could swiftly claim her life. Her body, weakened by labor and potentially injured, was highly susceptible, with no antibiotics to offer a defense. The decision-making process during a difficult birth was also outside her control. If labor was prolonged or a complication arose, the women attending her midwives or other experienced female relatives would make decisions based on tradition, superstition, or their limited practical experience. There was no concept of a patient's right to refuse a procedure or to demand a certain course of action. Her body was simply acted upon, its fate determined by the available, often inadequate, remedies and interventions. Furthermore, the very purpose of a woman's body in childbirth was often viewed as a religious duty, a consequence of Eve's sin. The pain of childbirth was explicitly linked to the biblical curse, framing it not just as a physical process, but as a spiritual one. This theological interpretation further diminished a woman's agency. Her suffering was considered a penance, something to be endured, rather than a medical condition to be alleviated. Her body was serving a higher purpose, and her personal comfort was secondary to the divine will. the physical toll of repeated pregnancies was also immense. Many women in 1208 would have been pregnant multiple times throughout their childbearing years, their bodies constantly stretched, depleted, and vulnerable. Miscarriages and stillbirths were tragically common, each a physical and emotional trauma that her body had to endure and recover from, often without sufficient rest or nutrition. Her womb, her pelvis, her entire physical structure was continually stressed, used, and sometimes broken by the relentless cycle of reproduction. Childbirth in 1208 was a stark and brutal illustration of a woman's body not being her own. It was a vehicle for procreation, subjected to extreme physical duress and mortal danger, with no personal control over the process or its outcome. Physical being was a battleground of life and death, defined by forces beyond her command, a raw testament to her fundamental lack of autonomy over her corporeal self. Number 1. Marriage and reproduction. In 1208, for a woman, the central event that irrevocably bound her body to external forces and defined her entire existence was marriage. This was not a union typically born of romantic love or personal choice, but a meticulously orchestrated arrangement of alliance, property, and lineage. Her body, from a very young age, was viewed as a critical component in this elaborate social and economic calculus, making it profoundly not her own. The decision of whom a woman would marry was almost universally made by her male relatives, her father, guardian, or even her lord. Girls could be betrothed, sometimes from infancy, and married in their early to mid-teens, often with little to no input from the girl herself. Physical readiness for marriage, her burgeoning body, was a practical consideration, as the primary purpose of marriage was undeniably procreation. Her body was specifically selected and exchanged to ensure the continuation of a family line, to secure land, or to forge political alliances. The very act of her physical union was therefore a strategic tool, not a personal decision. Consent, if sought at all, was a mere formality, a whispered acquiescence rather than an independent choice. The idea of her refusing a match chosen by her family, especially for noble or wealthy peasant families, was almost unthinkable and could have severe social and economic repercussions for her and her entire kin. Her body, quite literally, was a pawn in a game played by men. Once married, a woman's body became primarily a vessel for reproduction. The expectation to bear children, particularly male heirs, was immense and unrelenting. A woman's value and standing within her new household and community were often directly tied to her ability to produce offspring. If she proved to be barren, her body was considered a failure, a grave disappointment to her husband and his family. Pressure to conceive was not just social, but also religious, as the church emphasized the sanctity of marriage for the purpose of procreation. Her womb was not her own. It was a resource to be utilized for the family's future, for the continuity of the lineage, and for the perpetuation of her husband's name. This meant that her physical being was under constant scrutiny for signs of pregnancy, and her overall health was judged by her reproductive capacity. Her cycles of pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding became the defining rhythm of her adult life, a relentless demand on her physical resources. A peasant woman might have as many pregnancies as her body could physically sustain, often resulting in numerous births, miscarriages, and the constant depletion of her health. Her body was a factory, its output rigorously monitored. Furthermore, within marriage, the woman's body was considered her husband's property. Marital relations were seen as a husband's right and a wife's duty. While the church did acknowledge a wife's right to sexual relations, the emphasis was on procreation and the husband's needs. A wife's refusal to engage in sexual relations with her husband, unless under specific church-sanctioned conditions like an illness, could be grounds for legal action or severe marital discord. Physical intimacy was not hers to control or choose. It was an obligation within the marital contract. Her body in its most private and intimate functions was not her own, but was bound by the legal and social expectations of her marriage. Even her physical appearance after marriage, from her required modesty in dress to the changes wrought by repeated pregnancies, reflected her status as a wife and mother, her body a testament to her fulfillment of societal roles. There was no concept of a woman independently choosing to live a child-free life or selecting a partner based purely on affection. Her body, from the arrangement of her marriage to the demands of procreation, was fundamentally under the control of patriarchal systems, religious doctrine, and the pressing need for family continuity. It was the ultimate embodiment of a woman's profound lack of personal autonomy in 1208.